Welcome to SportsBeat KC, the Kansas City Star's daily sports podcast. It's Monday, April 6th. I'm Blair Kerkhoff. Sports news did happen this weekend, but not all of it the kind we wanted to hear. On the positive side, the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame announced its star-studded class with the likes of Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, and Kevin Garnett, so that was pretty cool. Also this weekend, President Trump held a teleconference with commissioners of all the major sports leagues to discuss return to play in the COVID-19 pandemic. We talk about these topics with Star columnists Vahe, Gregorian, and Sam Mellinger. Sam wrote a terrific column about returning to sports that ran in Sunday's Star and is on the kansascity.com website. We'll link to it in the show notes. So here we go with Vahe and Sam. Well, tonight would have been the NCAA championship game at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta. I'm guessing that we all would have been there with Kansas. I think the Jayhawks were the best team in the nation. The best team doesn't always get to the championship game, but I don't know. The Udoka Azubuike, Devon Dotson 1-2 punch, I thought was going to be a pretty good combo for Kansas this year in the postseason. We're not there. They're not there. But it got me thinking about some of the better NCAA championship games we've seen over the years. We both have seen a lot of them. How about you guys? Have you got a favorite or a memorable NCAA title game?
Well, Blair, I've certainly got a few, and I may have brought this up in this very format recently, but the first one I ever went to, the first NCAA tournament game I ever went to was the KU Oklahoma game in 1988, the national title game, because a friend got me a ticket that day and said, "You want to come over?" And I was like, "Sure." So that
from St. Louis, right? From
St. Louis, yeah. Just got in the car and drove over. Seemed like I parked by the Golden Ox somewhere down there by Kemper, and I really had no idea what I was in for. Of course, I'd seen some NCAA tournament and Final Fours on TV, but the feeling in there was just intoxicating and unforgettable, and sort of made me think I'd like to cover a few of those. And luckily, the job has taken all of us there a lot of years. And so many of those Final Fours were just fascinating to cover, whether it was, kind of the crazy matchup that you got in there, or just the celebration or the unforgettable title games, or the path along the way. Whether, I don't know what your favorite upsets were, but I always remember being at Princeton upsetting UCLA and games like that. And I know we're talking about the Final Four right now, but what the Final Four always feels like is the sort of final punctuation mark on all that leads into that Final Four. So I'm rambling and yet not saying anything. So why don't I defer to Sam?
Well, the 1985 World Series is the first game. It's the first thing, at least in my memory, that my parents let me stay up to watch.
Oh, wow.
Once
that was
they
a good
did
one.
that, the floodgates were open. You know what I mean? And so right after that, it was the NCAA championship game. I mean, the Final Four games are obviously on Saturday, so that wasn't as big of a deal. It's not a school night, but that Monday night, I talked them into letting me do that as well. And I remember, the Purvis Ellison. They beat Duke, right? The 86 Louisville.
Right, after
team.
Duke beat KU, right?
Yeah. With the Archie Marshall.
Danny Manning in foul trouble.
Yep. And so I remember that game. Well, the first basketball game that I was able to stay up late on a school night. But right after that, Keith Smart and Kansas in '88. That '89, the next year. Michigan won with Steve Fisher, but if I remember right, that was also I'll remember that tournament forever. That was the tournament of Bo Kimball, wasn't it, with Loyola Marymount? There's so many of those games, and I just, like, as a kid, there was something about college basketball, the characters, and maybe it was that time in the sports history too. I feel like college basketball kind of, at least for me, and we all look at it through our own personal lens, at least for me, it kind of peaked in the 90s. There was a good sweet spot of guys playing, staying in college, longer than they do now. So you got to know them. They became characters, like the was it Alex Dillard had the longest short. I mean, they were basically pants that he wore. You remember the guy for the guard for Arkansas that won the title was Scotty Thurman, and the 90 UNLV team that won the national championship game by something like 106 points, and that Duke team that won back to back. I mean, it's just there was a time in my life, I'd probably have to think about it now for at least a few hours, but I could have named the last 20 national championship games in order. I mean, it's just and unfortunately, the first one that I saw in person was it would have been 2011, I think, with that UConn Butler game that was just horrendous to watch.
Awful game.
That thing stunk. So unfortunately, that's in there too. But there's just something about the characters involved, the coaches, but also the players, especially back in the 90s, that just made this, one of the 2, 3, 4 games that I look forward to the most in a calendar year.
The first national championship game I remember was actually 1970 when UCLA was on its run with John Wooden, and they beat Jacksonville with it wasn't Alcindor, but Jacksonville had Artis Gilmore, and I can remember that game on television. It was the final was on a Saturday afternoon back then. But then I started watching. I was sucked in because my family had moved from suburban Philadelphia to North Carolina. And if you're in North Carolina, you're going to be interested in college basketball. So I just remember from basically then on, it was just live for the NCAA tournament. And I happened to be there during the David Thompson years of North Carolina State and winning the championship in '74, and North Carolina teams with Dean Smith. And anyway, those were just really exciting times. And I think one of the great things about the NCAA tournament is it makes it a little bit different than other sports championships that's build to a crescendo in the championship. I love Final Four weekend. I love the semifinal Saturday and the title game, but I think I enjoy the regional, the Sweet 16 round, and then the first and second round just as much. In the baseball playoffs, it doesn't work that way. You gear up for the World Series, and even in the NFL, you love the playoffs, but the Super Bowl was the can't miss game. I think in March, it's every weekend. I feel that way because you get the upsets in the early part of the tournament, and then you get the strong survived on Final Four weekend, and that's why it's, to me, the greatest month of sports that you got is March. And
I feel the same way, Blair. Just to jump in real quick, I mean, it kind of becomes this whole tapestry in a way that the other sports don't quite have. I mean, obviously, each one is a rung on the ladder to get to whether it's the Super Bowl or the World Series. But there is something. I mean, each matchup changes based on what else has happened, and all those kinds of things. So it's kind of a living, breathing, organic thing all along the way, and I think that's as much or more what makes the final weekend special.
For sure. Hey, let's keep it on basketball here for a second. There was news this weekend because at the Final Four every year, the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame class is announced. That's always one of the highlights of that weekend because these great coaches and former great players avail themselves to the media, and you get an opportunity to talk to folks that you otherwise wouldn't have. And this year, it was just such a star-studded class, maybe one of the greatest classes of all time. Among those going in, posthumously, Kobe Bryant, and then Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, and these were guys who starred, or at least got their career started in the '90s and went through the first decade of the 21st century, and just were fantastic. I mean, just great basketball players. If you get one of those guys in a Hall of Fame class, it's usually a pretty good class. But to have all three of them in, and it occurred to me, Sam, just because of where you are in life, that you would have, and you're probably a bigger NBA fan than either Vahe or I, but you saw these guys in their heyday.
Yeah, you know what? My first reaction when I saw the class was thinking, oh, they waived the waiting period for Kobe Bryant, which they didn't, obviously. Right. Yeah, but it struck me that that's how short of a time it feels since his career ended, at least to me. And maybe some of that is, how much the whole basketball world, the sports world has been thinking about him recently. So maybe that increases it a little bit. But Kobe Bryant, I think, is like a year older, a year younger than me, something like that. And it was like one of the first times I remember watching that draft and thinking, my God, like we're the same age and he's doing that and I'm doing this, and it was just like one of those kind of like life-changing, weird life-changing moments for me. I was like, oh my gosh, I am behind. I need to get going on this. Tim Duncan, this is, kind of a weird thing, but there was this video game in the 90s, Coach K basketball, and I forgot if it was on like Sega Genesis or what. But me and some friends used to, every day after school or practice, depending on what time of year it was, just have these epic battles. And Tim Duncan was a badass on that game. And, it was one of those first, like Wake Forest is kind of a little bit, not obscure, but certainly, it's not North Carolina, it's not Kentucky, it's not whatever. And I remember like checking him out like on the real thing, like him and Randolph Childress or whatever playing on ESPN. I was like, oh, right, they got it right in that game. Like he really is this good. And then the Kevin Garnett, the big memory I have of him is he was, obviously this is not a unique memory to me, but, kind of the first of that wave of, high school to the NBA guys. And I remember reading, I think it was in Sports Illustrated, a story about that. And he didn't want to, at least that's the way the story was written. He wanted to go to college, but I think his test scores weren't high enough. And it was just going to be this thing where maybe he had to go to JUCO or something like that. So well, screw it. Let's see how this goes. And there was something about him that I just kind of rooted for. And I don't know if it was his intensity. I don't know if it was, seeing a young guy. Like it seemed like at the time to me that the consensus was this guy's not ready. He's going to get beaten up, look how skinny he is, all that stuff. And there was something about that I just kind of rooted for, on his way up. And then, do you guys remember the ESPN, the magazine commercials, where with him and Steph Marbury when they were both with the Timberwolves and they were talking about like the nudes and it was like tastefully done.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch, man. Those guys, they really are. I mean, you said it, man. Like they all at least started their careers in the 90s and just been absolute fixtures in the NBA for 2 decades. I mean, like the Garnett, like anything is possible, interview on the court after winning the championship and some of the trash talking that he does. I mean, those guys are just fundamental to the history of the league. And then there's a bunch of others too. I mean, like Rudy Tomjanovich. I mean, I remember him, more as a coach than a player, but, Kim Mulkey. I mean, there's just it really is just an absolute star-studded list.
And I know for Vahe and I, one of the enshrinees that we covered and feel really good about his getting in is Eddie Sutton.
Yeah,
that was long overdue. And I'm going to talk to Barry Trammell of the Oklahoman about this later. But I was so happy to see Eddie Sutton get in. And there's a guy with 800 career victories who is from Kansas, born in Buckland, Kansas, grew up in the state of Kansas, but made his reputation at Arkansas, Kentucky, Oklahoma State, among others. Creighton was where he got his start. And it was long overdue. He's 84 years old and doesn't speak well anymore. In fact, I think they either put the notice from John DeLeva at the Hall of Fame, the phone call on a speakerphone so Eddie could hear. But it was, better late than never for Eddie Sutton. And 3 Final Fours. He's long overdue on this. And I was just so happy to see Eddie Sutton get called.
Same here, Blair. And I've got a lot of emotion when it comes to Eddie Sutton because of the road he's traveled in a lot of ways. And it's while we were talking, I had looked up something I wrote on him in 2005. We were doing a series of stories when I was at the Post-Dispatch on St. Louis's relationship to the Final Four as it was coming back to St. Louis. And long story short, I spent quite a lot of time with Eddie, and he talked openly about his battle with alcoholism and the impact it had on his life. We talked about other very difficult things that they encountered. Obviously, the horrible Oklahoma State plane crash, and the guy was just has been, still is, so resilient. I think we were kind of fortunate, Blair. You might have known him a little before I did, but certainly I didn't get to know him until he came to Oklahoma State, came back to his alma mater, and I think we were seeing him at a different time of his life than a lot of the troubled times in his life, and I'm sure he still wrestled with a lot of things. But I thought he was quite a gentleman, a great coach, and I didn't know this, or I'd forgotten this, when he went from Buckland to Oklahoma State to enroll, he hitchhiked.
Right.
And that was just sort of the way it was back then. And one other little bit about Buckland, I'd forgotten this too, but it's a town of 1,000. He had a cow named Flossie, a pony named Tony, and no electricity or indoor plumbing until about 9th grade. And he presented that as better than most people had. And I think that says something about how Eddie Sutton looked at the world, and still looks at the world.
I did a story on Eddie, and I think it was 2011, and the headline was "A Country Song Kind of Life." Eddie Sutton, because of all the everything he'd been through as a coach. So, okay, let's take a break here. When we come back, I want to get into the future of sports based on the conversation that President Trump had with commissioners of the sports leagues this weekend. We'll be back in just a second. Hey, it's Blair. Hey, we have a special subscription offer for SportsBeat KC listeners, unlimited digital access to the Kansas City Star's award-winning sports coverage. Sign up now for 1 year of Sports Pass for access to all the sports news, features, and columns we have to offer. And it's only $30. That's a 40% savings off our regular rate. For your convenience, your subscription will automatically renew after the initial term at $50 unless you tell us to cancel. A lot of subscription services won't tell you that. They'll just sneak it on there. We just told you. Your subscription helps support the sports coverage of kansascity.com and the Kansas City Star. Please visit kansascity.com/SportsBeatKC offer to get this special offer. And as always, thanks for listening. Hi, we are back with Sam Mellinger and Vahe Gregorian talking sports on SportsBeat KC. And guys, it was besides the Hall of Fame announcement on Saturday, another relatively quiet weekend in sports. There were some esports happening and a couple other little things. But I think, Vahe, you may have mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. We look at our sports on TV graphic and on page 2 of the Star, and too often it just says nothing. There isn't anything. Or and I'm really looking forward to the day when it does say something. And I don't know if we can qualify this as a hint, but there at least was some sort of statement made by President Trump over the weekend when he was on a conference call with commissioners of NFL, NBA, NHL, Major League Baseball, WNBA, all the sort of the major sports, and they were just kind of figuring out what the path is for sports. And Trump was saying, or at least said, based on the reporting that came out of there, that he expects the NFL to start on time in September and to have fans back in the stands in August. Now, there is that doesn't it doesn't agree with what some of the governors are saying, starting with the Governor Newsom of California, who doesn't think that that's going to be possible at all in his state. In fact, they're trying to rush to get the stadium, the football stadium, complete there, where the Rams and Chargers are going to play, and that's been delayed, so it's probably not going to be open on time. But anyway, is that being too optimistic? And Sam, I ask you that because you wrote about this in Sunday's paper, terrific column that I thought was pretty, maybe brutally honest about this and when sports can start. Just tell us about the column and what some of the conclusions were.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of this idea. It does seem like the debate the last week or two has been a lot of, well, we'll have games pretty soon, maybe without fans, but there'll be games. And so some of my motivation in doing that piece was just sort of, okay, like, is that really realistic? Like, can that happen? What are some of the logistics that teams, that leagues would have to go through to be able to make that? It's a lot more complicated than just, well, as long as there's not, 40,000 people in baseball or 75,000 people in football or whatever, as long as there's not these big crowds in the stands, we should be good. But, the Japan League, the Nippon Baseball League in Japan tried this, and they tried, the equivalent of spring training games in front of empty stadiums. And they had, daily screenings of everybody that went into the stadium. There's at least one team that was, effectively quarantined in, sort of an apartment complex or dorm complex kind of place. And again, empty stadiums. And that lasted 5 days before there was a positive. And once there's one positive, you kind of have to shut the whole thing down, because that means one team, it's got to be quarantined for a while. And, there's just a ton of hoops that have to be jumped through. And look, the conference call with the president and the commissioners, I think it's fine to project confidence, I don't feel like saying, well, I hope that we can play football in September, September 10th, presumably at Arrowhead Stadium on a Thursday night is when the NFL season would start. I don't think there's necessarily a problem in saying like that's the hope, but there's sort of, you hope for the best, you prepare for the worst, right? And once you line up these timelines, you see, you mentioned what the California governor said, and I think it was Virginia, right, that had a shelter in place that they put through June 30th. Was that right?
Yes.
Once you put these timelines together, how long you need for training camp, and let's just, as well with this, like June 30th may not be the end of shelter in place, right? There's just so many logistics that have to happen. It's hard for me to imagine once you stack, okay, this has to happen before this other thing, and then that has to happen before this third thing. Once you stack those things together, I just don't know that you're looking at September 10th as being very realistic. And I know that people inside the sport kind of feel the same way. I mean, I think there's a lot of unknowns. We should say that. Like, I don't know anything. You guys don't know anything. People listening don't know anything. All we know is what we hear and read from the actual experts, and we can extrapolate on that. But I know for a fact that people within baseball are getting very worried about the whole 2020 season just being washed. And I know for a fact that people in football are not privately, I guess is the way to say it, projecting the same confidence that Trump did on that call, or that the NFL did about a week before that call on a conference call with reporters, saying like all our focus is to have the season start on time. The NFL has a little bit of a benefit in schedule. They can push back. There's no reason that it has to start September 10th and it can't start October 10th and November 10th. They can push back a little bit. With baseball, it gets a lot more complicated, how far you can push back before you bump into the 2021 season. And
football also, and I read this morning in Peter King's great Monday morning quarterback column. Privately, NFL folks are talking about, the schedule release is supposed to happen, I think, the first week in May. But now they're working on what a 12-game schedule or a 14-game schedule might look like, in addition to the 16-game schedule. So, look, you're right, Sam. We don't know anything. And Vahe, before you comment on this, here's my concern: is that we feel this way about it now as we stand at the first day of a week when the news is supposed to be at its worst, right? The numbers are supposed to spike, and what the Surgeon General say that this is going to be a Pearl Harbor type of week in terms of numbers. So I think it's being pessimistic now. It just sort of fits the mood. But when we get on the other side of this, after we peak and the curve flattens, that's when my big concern is. Yeah. We'll all feel so optimistic, and the numbers are receding, and we should be able to have sports, and until there's until there is a vaccine and testing for everyone, I don't see how that can happen.
I agree with you, Blair. I think Sam alluded to that too. Pardon me if I'm not remembering right, but I think Sam got into that in the column a little bit too about the danger of returning too soon, or he's written about it in some other form. And I think that's something that it's such human nature right now to want to find glimmers of hope and see a path or something with just a little clarity. So it's really easy to cling to the sorts of things that tell you, okay, this is right around the corner. I've tried to, for what it's worth, just tell myself I'm trying to get to certain checkpoints for reevaluation time. But that's as confident as I feel about anything. Like, okay, I think we're still under a 30-day order in Kansas City. I don't think anything's going to be lifted in 30 days, but I feel like, all right, let's get to that 30 days and let's see how we reassess then. What's the landscape look like then? I feel like we have to keep it in bite-sized pieces. And, Sam, that was a great column. It really was, and it was important. And I think the reason it's important is we all have to be thinking hard about this difference between having hope and just making stuff up. And in all candor, the person suggesting hope here is someone who made it seem like this was a hoax only about a month ago, and 2 weeks ago thought we'd be open by April. So it's hard to put stock. By Easter. So it's a little hard to put stock in what basis he might have for saying these things. So I think also, Blair, I'm glad you brought that up about Peter King's column and about the scheduling, because I was thinking, all right, if you really feel gung-ho that that season should start on time, then we'll see that schedule on time. And that's still a few weeks away from when it would normally come out. But let's see that 16-game schedule. And just the fact that they're already making provisions otherwise suggests that not just they're being cautious, but that they're actually being prudent.
Another sport that has already made some rescheduling moves is golf, right? We know that the British Open has been canceled for 2020, but the three other majors have rescheduled and pushed their calendar back. And no event pushed farther back on the calendar than the Masters, which was going to occur this week, scheduled to start on Thursday, and now November. I didn't get the days. Is it around Thanksgiving or something they've planned for the Masters, which just seems crazy to me. But look, why wouldn't you at least put it out there, put it on the schedule? Why not? If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. I think golf kind of lends itself to perhaps a sport where you can maintain a distance and control the gallery, or not have a gallery at all. Maybe golf would be one of the first sports to return.
It sure seems like, there may be a reason that somebody much smarter than me would present about why that couldn't happen. But, I'm not, this is not a golf joke that I'm making, right? I like golf. I wish I golfed more, but I think that it's sort of made for social distancing, right? Like, you can have somebody pull the pins if you're worried about that. You can have somebody rake the traps if you're worried about that. But, it's obviously a non-contact sport. There doesn't have to be touch. I mean, I would think that golf would be the first sport to kind of get back online. And, there's one other thing too that, and this was in that column, but it's worth emphasizing here, is that 5 months is a long time. And I'm just using 5 months as, the NFL schedule. A lot can change, good and bad, right? But one potential, sort of game changer, no pun intended, that I think could make playing that schedule on time more realistic is testing. And if there were plentiful tests where the results came back immediately, and I have no idea, obviously, how likely that is, or if the medical technology exists to make that happen. But if you had a system where every player, every support staff, everybody that's going in and out of a stadium for a game with no fans, if you had a system where every one of those people each one of those people could be tested, and just know, and obviously keep out anybody that tests positive. If you could have that situation, then I think that would be a significant hurdle to clear, to have games without fans. But even that feels, a little like wishful thinking right now.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, it's a strange place we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And but look, it's where we are, and it's what we're dealing with. And I can't think of anybody I'd rather discuss the topic with than you guys. I enjoyed the chat today, and we'll do it again soon. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, man.
Thanks, Blair.
That'll do it for today. Thanks for lending us your ears, and thanks to the production squad of Derek Donovan, Savannah Smith, Randy Mason, Beth Welsh, Jeff Rosen, and Chris Fickett. Cap tip to Sam Mellinger and Vahe Gregorian for making time to chat today. Hey, there's no better local coverage of the day's important news and sports than in the Kansas City Star and on kansascity.com. Please consider a digital subscription at account.kansascity.com/subscribe. That's account.kansascity.com/subscribe. We'll be back on Tuesday for another SportsBeat KC, where we talk sports in Kansas City every day.